Good evening. Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack. He was found at his home in Memphis, not breathing. His road manager tried to revive him. He failed. A hospital tried to revive him. It had failed.
Elvis Presley's death, the end of a once celebrated and iconic life, was tragically undignified. Known as the King of Rock and Roll, his public persona was full of charisma and confidence, but the state of his body when he died revealed the contrast between his glitzy image and his private struggles. At the time of his death, Elvis's health had severely deteriorated. His heart had grown weak, his intestines in distress from years of neglect, and his body was found in a state that mirrored the overuse of prescription pills. The man who once captivated the world with his energy and charm was now a shadow of himself, trapped in his own physical decline. It's a stark reminder of the realities of fame and the hidden battles that even the most adored celebrities can face. Elvis Presley was a cultural phenomenon. From the moment he burst onto the music scene, he became the king of rock and roll, a revolutionary figure who reshaped music, fashion, and youth culture. His talent was undeniable, his charisma electric, and his rise to fame was meteoric. But as the years went on, Elvis's vibrant public persona began to shift. No longer the energetic performer, he retreated into the solitude of Graceland. The man who once performed on stage with a raw passion now found himself confined to his home, a reclusive figure who struggled with loneliness and a sense of isolation. The king of rock and roll, adored by millions, was now a prisoner of his own fame, wrestling with the pressures of success and the toll it took on his body and mind. As Elvis Presley's career continued to soar, so too did the weight of his personal struggles. Fame came with its own unique burdens, and for Elvis, the intense pressure to remain at the top eventually started to erode his well-being. What once seemed like invincibility, his energy, his drive, his powerful stage presence, began to fade, replaced by a series of deeply troubling issues that were physical, emotional, and mental. In the early years of his career, Elvis was known for his athleticism. His performances were electric, full of energy and life. His voice was as powerful as his movements, and his physicality on stage was a major part of his allure. But as the years passed, his body began to change. His once svelte figure became heavier. The weight gain didn't happen all at once, but rather it was a gradual process, almost like a slow, creeping transformation. Elvis, who had once been a symbol of vitality and sex appeal, began to lose his former shape. By the mid-1970s, his weight had spiraled out of control, a reflection of deeper, unaddressed issues. The weight gain was not just a cosmetic problem, it was indicative of larger, more troubling health concerns. Elvis's unhealthy eating habits became a significant part of his life. Overeating was not simply an occasional indulgence, it was an obsession. He had a love for greasy foods, high-calorie meals, and sugary snacks that only seemed to worsen as he became more withdrawn from the public eye. Graceland, the mansion that had once been a haven of luxury and grandeur, now felt like a prison. His food consumption became an escape, a way to cope with the overwhelming pressures he faced, the isolation, and perhaps even a growing sense of purposelessness. But it wasn't just food that took a toll on Elvis's body. In the early years, he'd always been careful with his health, but over time he became increasingly reliant on prescription medications. Doctors, in an attempt to treat various ailments, began prescribing Elvis a wide array of drugs. His need for medication started as a way to manage his physical pain, but soon it morphed into a dependency that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Painkillers, sleeping pills, amphetamines, and sedatives all became part of his daily routine. A cocktail of substances designed to mask the physical and mental anguish he was experiencing. Elvis's struggle with weight and medication was intricately linked to his mental health. What started as a physical transformation became a mirror for his inner turmoil. His once vibrant energy was slowly replaced by fatigue and lethargy. He seemed to have lost the spark that once drove him, and with it, his ability to perform at the same level he once did. The physical changes were one thing, but the mental decline was even more devastating. Elvis's mind was deteriorating as much as his body. Depression was a constant companion, and anxiety gripped him in moments of solitude. The man who had once commanded a stage with a magnetic presence now struggled to leave the confines of Graceland. His reclusiveness became more pronounced as the years went on, and the loneliness he felt only seemed to deepen with every passing day. He was no longer the king of rock and roll in the same way he had been in the 1950s. Instead of performing in front of adoring crowds, Elvis found himself surrounded by people who were more concerned with enabling his habits than actually helping him. His friends, family, and even his doctors, many of whom knew of his addiction, failed to intervene in a meaningful way. This created an environment where Elvis was left to spiral further into isolation, eating and medicating himself in an attempt to escape the mental and physical pain he endured. What's tragic is that this downward spiral wasn't just a result of a rock star lifestyle gone awry. There was a real struggle beneath the surface, one that was intensified by the constant pressure of fame and the growing sense that no one could truly understand what he was going through. Elvis wasn't just battling addiction and poor health, he was facing the psychological weight of being a legend, of having millions of eyes on him while he felt like a ghost in his own life. His mental health issues were compounded by his growing sense of paranoia. Elvis started to feel as though people were out to get him, and he became increasingly distrustful of those around him. He was particularly wary of his doctors, many of whom he felt were taking advantage of him. His relationship with his own body became fractured. He was unable to control his weight, his health, or the endless need for drugs, and this only fed his growing sense of desperation. What had once been an intense desire to create and perform had transformed into a desire to numb himself from the pain, to escape the reality he could no longer face. As Elvis continued to decline physically, his mental state also began to show signs of deterioration. He experienced mood swings, periods of extreme exhaustion, and intense irritability. The man who once held the world's attention with his music now found himself unable to perform at the level he once did. His last concerts, though still popular, were a far cry from the energetic shows he had put on in the past. Elvis would often appear lethargic on stage, struggling to keep up with the demands of his performances. His voice, which had once been a force of nature, was now strained and hollow, a reflection of the exhaustion that seemed to have overtaken him. Elvis's isolation grew even more pronounced during this period. He retreated to Graceland, his personal sanctuary, a place where he could hide from the world. Yet even there, he was not free from the weight of his issues. His home had become a symbol of his inner conflict, a place that had once represented success and happiness, but which now stood as a prison of his own making. The toll of years of physical neglect, combined with his emotional and psychological decline, left Elvis a shell of his former self. It became clear to those close to him that his struggles were not just about food, weight, or medication, but about deeper issues that went unaddressed. His mental health was in dire straits, yet the focus was always on his physical appearance, and the medications continued to pile up. What Elvis needed wasn't more pills. It was genuine care, real intervention, and support that went beyond the surface. In the final years of his life, Elvis was no longer the vibrant man who had inspired millions. He had become a man trapped by his own body and mind, unable to break free from the cycle of physical and mental decline that had taken over his life. The pressures of fame, coupled with his growing dependence on medication and unhealthy habits, had stripped him of the very qualities that had made him the king of rock and roll. And yet even in his darkest days, he held on to the fragments of the persona he had built, a king, even as he lost the battle within himself. Elvis Presley was no stranger to prescription medication. Like many performers of his era, he relied on a variety of substances to keep up with the grueling demands of his career. In the beginning, it seemed harmless, just something to keep him awake on long tours, to ease the aches and pains that came with high-energy performances, or to help him sleep after the adrenaline rush of a show. But what started as a simple reliance on prescribed medication soon turned into something far more dangerous. By the late 1960s, Elvis's dependence on drugs was spiraling out of control. He took amphetamines to stay energized, barbiturates to sleep, opiates to numb the constant pain, and tranquilizers to calm his nerves. His medicine cabinet wasn't just full, it was overflowing. He carried multiple bottles of pills wherever he went, and his inner circle, known as the Memphis Mafia, often enabled his habits rather than challenging them. The men closest to him, the ones who were supposed to protect him, instead ensured that he always had access to whatever substances he wanted. The effects of these drugs were devastating. Elvis became sluggish and incoherent at times, slurring his words during conversations and struggling to focus. His once sharp mind, the same one that had allowed him to memorize complex song lyrics and choreography, now seemed dulled. He suffered from extreme mood swings, going from euphoric highs to crushing lows in the span of hours. The pills robbed him of the charisma and quick wit that had once made him one of the most beloved entertainers in the world. As his dependence worsened, so did his appearance. The side effects of the drugs, combined with his deteriorating health, led to rapid weight gain. His face became bloated, his eyes often bloodshot, and his movements sluggish. He no longer looked like the Elvis Presley the world had fallen in love with. Fans who attended his concerts in the mid-1970s were shocked to see the king of rock and roll stumbling on stage, sometimes forgetting lyrics or needing assistance just to get through a performance. At times, he would ramble incoherently, losing his train of thought as the drugs clouded his mind. But Elvis wasn't just losing himself on stage, he was also losing control of his life. His paranoia increased, and he started believing that people were plotting against him. He would wake up in the middle of the night convinced that someone was trying to break into Graceland. He often carried guns, even sleeping with them beside his bed, prepared for an enemy that didn't exist. His declining mental state, fueled by the toxic combination of medication and isolation, made him more erratic than ever. Despite the warning signs, no one stopped him. His doctors continued to write prescriptions, feeding his addiction rather than treating it. One doctor in particular, Dr. George Nikopoulos, nicknamed Shianatish Dr. Nick, became infamous for the staggering amount of medication he provided Elvis. It was later revealed that in the final years of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick had prescribed him over 10,000 doses of sedatives, amphetamines, and narcotics, an almost incomprehensible number. Each new prescription was another nail in the coffin, pushing Elvis further down on the path of self-destruction. He was trapped in a vicious cycle. He took uppers to stay awake, downers to sleep, and painkillers to numb the physical and emotional agony he couldn't escape. But the worst was yet to come. Elvis Presley was a man in crisis. His body, once strong and agile, had become a ticking time bomb. Years of overindulgence, prescription drug use, and untreated medical conditions had left him in a state of irreversible decline. His liver was failing, his heart was struggling, and his digestive system had become a disaster zone. One of the most horrifying aspects of Elvis's health problems was his chronic constipation. What many saw as a minor issue was, in reality, a severe medical condition that had plagued him for years. His intestines had become so enlarged from years of poor diet and medication abuse that they had stopped functioning properly. He would sometimes go weeks without a proper bowel movement, leaving him bloated and in excruciating pain. The constipation was so severe that his doctors eventually resorted to enemas and laxatives, but nothing seemed to provide lasting relief. Elvis's health problems didn't stop there. He was also battling high blood pressure, liver damage, glaucoma, and early signs of diabetes. His immune system was failing and he was constantly fatigued, unable to muster the energy to do even the most basic activities. Despite all of this, he continued to perform. He had become a prisoner of his own legend, forced to keep up appearances even as his body betrayed him. His final performances were a shadow of what they once were. Elvis, bloated and drenched in sweat, struggling to make it through songs that had once come effortlessly. By 1977, those closest to him knew the truth. Elvis wasn't just sick, he was dying. And then on the morning of August 16, 1977, the unthinkable happened. Elvis Presley was found unresponsive on the floor of his Graceland bathroom. He had been attempting to use the toilet when his body finally gave out. The cause? A massive heart attack triggered by years of prescription drug abuse, untreated health issues, and the immense strain of constipation. But the most shocking part? When doctors performed the autopsy, they discovered something horrifying. Elvis's colon was twice the normal size and packed with over 4 months' worth of waste. His body had been slowly poisoning itself from the inside, and in the end, it couldn't take it anymore. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, the man who had electrified audiences around the world, had died in one of the most tragic and undignified ways imaginable. Alone, collapsed on his bathroom floor, the victim of years of silent suffering. The day Elvis Presley died was, in a tragic sense, a culmination of everything that had been slowly killing him. His death was not the dignified end of a cultural icon, nor was it the peaceful passing of a man who had given everything to his art. Instead, it was shocking, undignified, and deeply unsettling. Elvis was found unresponsive on the bathroom floor of Graceland, his body slumped next to the toilet. The scene was gruesome, and the discovery of his body in such a way sent shockwaves throughout the world. The toilet death theory, as it would later be called, has remained one of the most talked about aspects of Elvis's death. Some would argue that his final moments were the result of years of neglect, poor health, and over-medication. But the theory that has gained particular attention is that Elvis's death may have been triggered by the immense strain caused by his chronic constipation. For months, Elvis had suffered from severe gastrointestinal distress. His body was overwhelmed by toxins, and his intestines, unable to function properly due to years of neglect, became severely impacted. The theory suggests that Elvis had been straining on the toilet when the pressure on his heart became too much. This physical strain, combined with the unhealthy buildup of waste in his body, may have contributed to the heart attack that took his life. His death, in this sense, was not just a result of his dependency on drugs or his physical ailments. It was the tragic outcome of a body that had been abused and neglected for far too long. Despite the theory gaining traction over the years, medical experts disagree on whether the constipation was the direct cause of Elvis's death. What is certain, however, is that his health had been in severe decline for years before that fateful morning. His organs were failing, his mind was fraying, and his body was beyond repair. It was a shocking end to a life that had once been full of promise, talent, and the kind of energy that had shaped an entire generation. The story of Elvis's death is incomplete without understanding the role of the medical professionals who treated him during his final years. For a man who was as famous as Elvis Presley, it might seem hard to believe that his health care would be anything less than top tier. But in truth, the medical care he received was a grave failure, one that ultimately contributed to his premature death. Dr. George Nicopolis, known as Dr. Nick, was Elvis's primary physician in the final years of his life. A man who had once been trusted with the care of one of the most famous men in the world, Dr. Nick became notorious for his role in enabling Elvis's drug addiction. While it's difficult to point to one single person as the cause of Elvis's decline, Dr. Nick's excessive prescribing of medication was undoubtedly a major factor in Elvis's downfall. In the years leading up to his death, Dr. Nick prescribed Elvis thousands of pills, painkillers, sedatives, stimulants, and tranquilizers. At times, Elvis was prescribed an astronomical number of pills, more than 10,000 over a short period of time. His medical record was a series of prescriptions that did little to address the root causes of his problems and only exacerbated the issues. Rather than seeking to help Elvis with his addiction or recommend appropriate mental and physical treatment, Dr. Nick continued to prescribe a cocktail of drugs that left Elvis in an increasingly compromised state. Dr. Nick's actions did not go unnoticed. After Elvis's death, the public and the authorities began to question his role in the singer's demise. The doctor was later brought to trial for overprescribing medications, though he was ultimately acquitted of any wrongdoing. The legal aftermath left many wondering how Elvis had been allowed to spiral so far without anyone intervening. How could a man who had changed the world through his music have been so utterly failed by the very people who were supposed to care for him? Elvis's death wasn't just a result of his own choices, it was also a consequence of a medical system that had failed to intervene, a culture that allowed celebrity to override genuine concern for health, and doctors who failed to provide the care Elvis so desperately needed. Following Elvis Presley's death, the autopsy report was shrouded in secrecy. While the official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, the full details of the autopsy would not be made public for decades. The family had requested that the autopsy be sealed, and for many years rumors and speculations swirled around what had truly caused the king's death. Was it the years of drug abuse? Was it the constant pain he had suffered in silence? Was there something darker hiding behind the official report? When the autopsy finally came to light, the results were as shocking as they were heartbreaking. It was revealed that Elvis's internal organs had suffered severe damage. His liver was in an advanced state of deterioration, showing signs of chronic disease. His heart, overworked and weakened by years of strain, was also found to be in terrible condition. In addition to this, extensive damage to his colon was discovered, confirming that the chronic constipation he had suffered from for years had caused irreversible harm to his digestive system. The revelation of these findings left the public stunned. not just because of the extensive damage to Elvis's body, but because it became clear that many of these health issues had been overlooked or ignored for years. His physical decline had not been sudden. It had been slow and insidious, a consequence of poor lifestyle choices, misdiagnoses, and a failure of medical professionals to address his underlying health problems. Elvis's relationship with drugs was complicated. What began as a medical necessity turned into an all-consuming addiction. His doctors initially prescribed medication to treat legitimate health concerns, but over time, the drugs became a crutch, a way to mask the physical and emotional pain he could no longer manage. The medical community's failure to recognize the severity of his addiction led to a vicious cycle of misdiagnosis and over-medication. As Elvis's final years unfolded, he continued to perform despite his declining health. Fans saw glimpses of the king they once knew, but the reality of his struggle was evident in every show. His performances, though still popular, were marred by his fatigue and physical deterioration. Even as he struggled, the world would remember him as the king of rock and roll, an icon who, in the end, became a tragic symbol of excess, addiction, and a life lost. As we reflect on the tragic journey of Elvis Presley, we are reminded that even the brightest stars can burn out in the most heartbreaking ways. His story is one of incredible talent, but also of vulnerability and the consequences of neglect. If this story moved you or left you with questions, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the untold stories of the legends we thought we knew. Stay tuned, and thank you for watching.